You've been told a lie since you were a child. You've heard preachers whisper it with holy trembling, you've seen paintings of a red-horned monster, and you've watched Hollywood twist it into a slick anti-hero. But strip all that away, no stained glass, no sermons, no smoke and fire, and you'll find something much darker, much smarter, much older. The real story of Lucifer isn't about a devil in a pit. It's about a light so pure it burned itself out. Lucifer wasn't a monster. He was brilliance itself. The Latin word means light-bearer, the morning star, the herald of dawn. The name comes from the same word the ancients used for Venus, the planet that shines just before sunrise. Think about that, a light that announces the day, but disappears when the true sun rises. It's poetic. It's devastating. It's cosmic rebellion written into the heavens. Now imagine this, a being crafted in perfect beauty. The most intelligent of the celestial hierarchy, the model of divine artistry. He wasn't crawling in filth, he stood next to the throne. The texts describe him as full of wisdom, perfect in beauty, adorned with every precious stone. His body was light, his voice like thunder wrapped in melody. He was not made of flesh and blood, he was made of frequency and fire. But that's where the rot began. Lucifer didn't fall because of sin in the human sense, he fell because he saw something in himself that reflected the Creator. He saw divinity in the mirror. The story says he declared, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High." That's not just arrogance, that's self-awareness weaponized. People hear that and think, oh, pride. Simple pride. But no, this wasn't ego in the way we know it. This was existential revolt. Lucifer looked at perfection and said, "Why not me?" He didn't want to destroy heaven, he wanted to replace its authority. He didn't want chaos, he wanted independence. And that's what made him dangerous. Think about this through the lens of power. Heaven was order, obedience, harmony. Every being functioned like a note in a divine symphony. But Lucifer? He changed the frequency. He hit a note that didn't belong, and the entire structure began to shake. That's what rebellion is, it's not noise, it's dissonance in a system built on harmony. So when people talk about the war in heaven, don't picture swords and fireballs. Picture vibration against vibration. Light against light. Consciousness dividing itself. A being of perfect brilliance splitting from the source that made him. The first fracture in creation. And when that fracture widened, heaven expelled him, not as punishment, but as containment. Because perfection cannot coexist with defiance. That's the core of the story. Lucifer wasn't cast down because God lost patience. He was cast down because heaven couldn't sustain a paradox, something both perfect and defiant at once. So he fell. Not into hell, not into fire, but into density, into time, into limitation. That's why the image of the morning star falling from heaven is so haunting. It's not just metaphor, it's cosmological poetry. Venus rises, burns bright, and fades before the true light appears. The ancients saw that pattern every morning and encoded it into myth. The brightest one, fading into shadow. The light-bringer, devoured by dawn. And from that image, religion built an entire demonology. They turned poetry into prosecution. But think about what that means. The entire narrative of Lucifer's fall is built on a cosmic observation, the rebellion of beauty against authority. The moment when brilliance refuses to bow. And here's where it gets even darker, the texts don't actually call him Lucifer in the way you think. The Hebrew version uses Helel ben Shakar, the Shining One, son of the dawn. It was originally describing a Babylonian king. A human tyrant whose arrogance mirrored the same pattern: rise, shine, collapse. It wasn't even a name, it was a warning. But over centuries, that poetic insult mutated. Translators turned it into a proper name, and theology weaponized it. Suddenly, Lucifer wasn't just a fallen star, it was the embodiment of rebellion. The angel who dared to question the throne. So when you hear the word Lucifer, you're not hearing a being's name. You're hearing an idea that's been demonized through translation. An ancient metaphor that grew teeth. But let's go deeper. Because underneath the religious layers, this myth carries psychological weight. Lucifer is the story of perfection corrupted by awareness. He didn't want to serve forever. He wanted to understand why he should. And the moment you ask why in a world built on obedience, you've already fallen. That's the real tension, creation versus autonomy. Heaven wasn't built for descent. So the first one who tried became its cautionary tale. Now picture the moment of expulsion. A legion of light collapsing into darkness. Energy cascading down the cosmic ladder. Angels, pure consciousness, becoming bound by gravity, time, and matter. That's what falling really means. Not tumbling through space, but losing frequency, losing resonance. Falling into density. That's why the oldest depictions don't show Lucifer as red or monstrous. They show him as radiant, sorrowful, almost human. Because the story is tragic, not grotesque. Imagine knowing infinite beauty, then being cut off from it. Imagine remembering the sound of creation's first note and never hearing it again. That's torment. That's exile. And that's why this story endures. Not because it scares people, but because it mirrors something we all feel, the pain of separation, the hunger for lost light. But make no mistake, this isn't sympathy. It's clarity. Lucifer's fall wasn't noble. It was catastrophic. Because when perfection fractures, the fallout doesn't stop with one being, it ripples through everything connected to it. The myth says a third of the heavenly host followed him. That's not just a number, it's a statement about influence. His rebellion infected creation itself. That's the dark genius of the legend. It's not about good versus evil. It's about infection, how one spark of self-will can challenge the entire structure of divine order. And from that infection, theology built its entire concept of evil. But here's the thing, it never said Lucifer stopped being an angel. It said he became a fallen one. Meaning he still carries the same brilliance, the same intellect, the same creative spark, just inverted. Turned inward. Light without obedience becomes fire without warmth. Illumination without purpose becomes illusion. So the story's essence is paradox, a being created to reflect divine glory becomes the embodiment of opposition. The mirror turns dark, but it still reflects. That's why so many ancient writers couldn't resist romanticizing him. Not because they worshipped evil, but because they saw tragedy and brilliance destroyed by defiance. Milton captured it perfectly centuries later, the grandeur of the rebel who would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. That line burned into Western consciousness because it speaks to something primal, the desire to define your own light, even if it kills you. And that's the bitter genius of this myth. The fall of Lucifer isn't a story about punishment, it's a story about consequence. The moment he claimed autonomy, he lost unity. The moment he declared himself self-sufficient, he became fractured. In a single act, light turned on itself. And that's why he's called the adversary. Not because he was evil from the start, but because he became the embodiment of opposition, the shadow cast by perfect illumination. When the texts say the dragon was cast down, it's describing the transformation of identity, the angelic consciousness descending into a lower vibrational state, the light-bearing one becoming the bringer of division. The war wasn't between good and evil, it was between obedience and will. And that's what makes the legend timeless. Because whether you see it as cosmic history or mythic allegory, the image burns the same, the brightest star falling into shadow. The beauty that turned against its source. You want to talk about rebellion? Let's go there, because what happened in heaven wasn't a tantrum, it was an uprising. And if you've been spoon-fed the Sunday school version where everything is white wings and harps, buckle up. The so-called war in heaven wasn't cute. It was intelligence versus authority, brilliance versus hierarchy, consciousness tearing itself apart from the inside out. Lucifer didn't storm the gates with fire, he shattered a system from within. He was the system. He was at the top, one of the highest-ranking beings in the cosmic chain of command. He understood the design, the architecture, the laws that made heaven run. He didn't just know the rules, he helped enforce them. And that's what made his rebellion catastrophic. You can't crash a machine if you don't know where the switches are. When he turned, he didn't just defy God, he weaponized knowledge. He knew how the heavens worked, the currents of energy, the structures of dominion, the harmonics of command. And when he broke rank, he didn't yell or beg, he recruited. He spoke like a politician in light form. Why worship something that keeps you beneath it? That was his campaign slogan. If we're created from light, why can't we rule in it? That's how he got them. Not with rage, but with reason. You've been told he was cast out instantly, like some impulsive cosmic slap. Wrong. Rebellion takes time. It spreads like a virus. The records talk about 1/3 of the host following him. That's not a coincidence, that's an infection rate. The war wasn't swords and halos, it was propaganda. It was the first ideological split in existence. Heaven divided by language, by persuasion, by vision. Picture this, ranks of radiant beings, each built for perfect service, suddenly questioning why. The air vibrating with uncertainty. That's not chaos, it's cognitive dissonance. It's creation turning the mirror on itself. Lucifer didn't just start a fight, he started thought. He introduced doubt into a place that had never known the word. That's what made it dangerous. Now imagine the reaction. The Archangel Michael, he wasn't some glowing choir boy. He was the commander of divine enforcement, built for war, not worship. The moment rebellion broke out, heaven became a courtroom and a battlefield. Michael wasn't defending the throne out of sentiment. He was defending the structure of reality itself. Because if Lucifer's argument won, if the idea that divinity could replicate itself spread, then the entire hierarchy of creation would implode. That's what this war was really about, authority versus autonomy. The throne wasn't fighting evil, it was fighting contagion. Because once you start believing you can be equal to the source, the system breaks. Think about it. 1/3 of the angels, these aren't idiots, decided to follow him. Why? You think all of heaven suddenly forgot who created them? No. They were seduced by logic. We are light. He is light. Why kneel to our reflection? That's not madness. That's metaphysics. It's dangerous intelligence disguised as liberation. Lucifer didn't promise chaos, he promised equality. He sold them the illusion of freedom. But the catch was brutal. The moment they chose self over structure, their light inverted. The frequency shifted. What used to resonate with creation now collided with it. That's the sound of falling, not fire, not screaming, disalignment. Energy losing sync with its source. Picture it like this, heaven as a vast field of resonance, all vibrating in perfect unity. Then one note goes rogue, and suddenly the entire field trembles. That's what Michael and his forces were up against, not a mob, but a wave of dissonance spreading through light itself. This wasn't war in the physical sense. It was the first energetic civil war. Order versus entropy. Harmony versus independence. And let's talk about that phrase, war in heaven. The ancient texts describe it, but not the way you think. The term war doesn't mean swords and shields, it means struggle, contest, opposition. Consciousness pushing back against its own boundaries. The very fabric of divine order was being tested. For the first time, something in creation looked at the Creator and said no. That no echoed across existence. It wasn't loud, but it was final. That's why it couldn't be forgiven. Because that sound, pure defiance from within perfection, was a rupture. It wasn't the act itself, it was the precedent it set. Once one being questioned the order, others could too. That's how universes collapse, from within, not from without. So heaven struck back. Michael led legions of loyal beings into confrontation, not because he hated Lucifer, but because he understood the stakes. The texts describe it like thunder. Light clashing with light, forms dissolving into radiant storms. Imagine plasma tearing through the firmament, energy colliding with energy, consciousness splitting into fragments. That's what happens when divine order goes to war with itself. And when it was over, there was no victory, only containment. The rebels were expelled. Cast down isn't about distance, it's about vibration. They were dropped into a lower density, a slower frequency. The light didn't vanish, it dimmed. That's what fall really means. Not downward, but inward. Light collapsing under its own pride. And yet, this is where it gets uncomfortable. The system still needed them. Because in destroying the rebel, heaven created contrast. Before the fall, there was only order. After the fall, there was polarity. Without knowing it, the war in heaven invented the concept of opposition. The cosmos now had tension, structure versus rebellion, creator versus creation. Every story since then echoes this pattern. You can almost hear the sarcasm in Lucifer's last words before being cast out. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That's not bravado, that's logic in despair. He understood what he'd done. He had built an argument so powerful that even in defeat, it reshaped the universe. But let's not romanticize him. He didn't lose because God threw a tantrum. He lost because his vision couldn't sustain itself. You can't build equality on rebellion, it collapses the moment it succeeds. Because what happens when everyone's a king? Who rules? That's the paradox that destroyed him. Michael's forces didn't just expel a rebel, they quarantined an idea. And the result of that quarantine is everything that came after: division, duality, opposition. Heaven wasn't the same after the war. The myth says the gates were sealed, the ranks reorganized, and the memory of rebellion turned into doctrine: serve or be expelled. But here's the real mind-bender. That means rebellion was never eradicated, it was institutionalized. Heaven learned to use the threat of Lucifer as a firewall. The story itself became the control mechanism. The fallen one became the reason obedience mattered. That's why this war still fascinates people. It wasn't about good and evil. It was about control and containment. Lucifer lost the war, but he infected the code. From that point on, creation would always carry the residue of dissent. Every willful act, every question, every spark of independence, that's the echo of that first rebellion. Heaven may have won the battle, but it couldn't erase the memory of defiance. Imagine the moment right after the expulsion. The sky silent. The light field scarred. The very geometry of heaven altered. You can almost feel the weight of what was lost, not just soldiers or angels, but innocence. Perfection had been tested and found vulnerable. That was the cost. The ancient writings say Lucifer's army was hurled to the lower realms. Don't think of that as punishment, think of it as exile. When vibration no longer aligns with the source, it has to exist somewhere else. That's physics, not theology. Heaven didn't throw him down, it recalibrated the system to keep functioning. The fall was a firewall update. And down there, in that slow, heavy, dim layer of creation, Lucifer still burns. Not as fire, but as memory. The memory of what it felt like to challenge perfection and lose. He became the eternal symbol of resistance, not because he triumphed, but because he dared. That's the uncomfortable truth. The war in heaven wasn't won by might, it was ended by necessity. Heaven couldn't annihilate its own light, even corrupted. So it caged it. The fallen weren't destroyed, they were contained in contrast. Let's tear apart one of the biggest linguistic scams in religious history. The name Lucifer. Everyone thinks it's a name for the devil. It isn't. It never was. It started as a word, just a simple word in Latin. Lux vere, light bringer. That's it. Not a fallen angel, not Satan, not the king of hell. A light. A planet. Venus. And that one mistranslation rewired centuries of theology. One linguistic slip became the face of evil. Here's what really happened. In the ancient Hebrew text, The prophet Isaiah mocked a Babylonian king, most likely Nebuchadnezzar, calling him Helel ben Shakar, the shining one, son of the dawn. It was a taunt, a poetic insult. You think you're the morning star? You think you rise like the dawn? Watch how far you fall. That was the tone. It wasn't a cosmic war story, it was politics. Prophetic trash talk. But centuries later, when the text was translated into Latin, Jerome, the man behind the Vulgate, chose to use Lucifer to describe that morning star. That's when everything went off the rails. Because language isn't neutral. Once you give a concept a name, it grows a personality. And once the word Lucifer hit the church circuits, it became a myth magnet. It fused with the already evolving idea of a rebellious angel and merged into one entity. The Lightbringer became the enemy of light. That's irony so thick you could cut it with a sword. Now here's where it gets even wilder. Lucifer wasn't even a negative term before Christianity weaponized it. The word pops up elsewhere in ancient Latin texts to describe Venus or even heroic figures associated with illumination. In Roman poetry, Lucifer literally means morning star, and it was beautiful. The light before the dawn. The symbol of enlightenment. Even Christ himself is called the morning star in the book of Revelation. Yeah, let that sink in, the same phrase tied to Jesus is the one we use to brand the devil. Someone flipped the script and never flipped it back. The confusion stuck because it was useful. The early church needed clear villains, not metaphors. They needed to personify rebellion so people wouldn't start thinking for themselves. So they took a metaphor about a fallen king and grafted it onto cosmic rebellion. Suddenly, a fallen ruler on earth became the prototype for a fallen angel in heaven. The narrative was clean, visual, and terrifying. That's propaganda gold. The psychology behind it is genius. You take the brightest symbol, the morning star, and you corrupt it. You turn beauty into a warning. You teach people that seeking your own light leads to destruction. It's not just a story, it's a control mechanism baked into language. Because if light can fall, who dares to shine? People hear the name Lucifer and picture red skin, horns, black wings, complete fiction. The original Hebrew doesn't describe a being at all. It's a title for arrogance, not an identity. Isaiah wasn't chronicling angelic history, he was mocking a dictator who thought he could rise above the heavens. The translation mutated the insult into a biography. And that's how myth metastasizes, through misunderstanding weaponized by authority. Now let's talk about the irony of the word itself. The Lightbringer was demonized by an institution that claimed to carry the light. You can't make this up. The church literally turned illumination into a sin. They said, he who brings light is the enemy. And then they branded their own teachings as the only approved light source. The word Lucifer became the theological firewall. Everything outside the church's light was his territory. Efficient. Ruthless. Brilliant. And here's the historical kicker, early Christians didn't even treat Lucifer as the devil's name at first. It took centuries of reinterpretation for the connection to solidify. Early theologians like Tertullian and Origen debated the meaning, but medieval theologians sealed the deal. They needed a dramatic figure to embody pride and downfall. Enter Lucifer. The poetic metaphor became dogma. This is how mythology gets industrialized. Step 1. Mistranslate. Step 2. Moralize. Step 3. Monaize. Once the idea took hold, it powered sermons, paintings, cathedrals, and fear campaigns for over 1,000 years. Lucifer fell because he tried to be like God. Translation: don't question your place. Don't think too high. Stay small. Stay obedient. The church turned a Babylonian taunt into a metaphysical muzzle. Now if you trace it linguistically, you'll see the pattern. Lucifer isn't even unique. In ancient Greek astronomy, Phosphorus or Eosphorus was the same thing as Venus, the morning star. These weren't devils. They were celestial symbols of beauty and intelligence. In fact, the Latin Vulgate uses Lucifer in other contexts positively, once even referring to Christ. So technically, if you're reading that version of the Bible straight, both Jesus and the devil share the same title. That's how tangled this gets when translation meets agenda. And don't forget, in ancient cosmology, Venus had dual aspects. Morning star, evening star. Rising and falling. Appearing, disappearing. Light that turns into darkness and back again. That cycle was symbolic, not satanic. The ancients understood duality. The Church, however, couldn't tolerate ambiguity. They flattened it, light good, dark bad. Dawn pure, dusk damned. Simplicity sells. You can see the shift visually in art history. Early depictions of Lucifer show him as radiant, angelic, golden, almost indistinguishable from Christ. But as doctrine hardened, his image degraded. The bright figure became monstrous. The face of the Lightbringer was erased and replaced with the grotesque. It's mythic Photoshop, rewriting the iconography of dissent. The irony is brutal. The same civilization that outlawed independent illumination literally named its villain the one who brings light. That's not coincidence, that's psychological warfare. Turn the archetype of enlightenment into a warning label. Make the torchbearer the boogeyman. Then no one dares to carry the torch again. But this isn't just theology, it's etymology turned into ideology. Every time someone says Lucifer as if it's a name, they're repeating a translation error that grew into a superstition. It's the linguistic version of a virus. It keeps replicating, generation after generation, reshaping thought. Even the timeline of the Lucifer as Satan connection is revealing. The Old Testament never mentions the devil by that name. The New Testament never calls Satan Lucifer. The link is entirely post-biblical, a medieval fusion of texts, mistranslations, and fear politics. But say something long enough, loud enough, and people will build entire religions around it. Now, think of how the name functions symbolically. Lightbringer. It implies intelligence, illumination, revelation. Everything the early church wanted to monopolize. That's why the rebranding was so powerful. It turned the very act of seeking truth into the mark of rebellion. If you question, you risk falling. If you bring new light, you risk damnation. You see how perfect that is as a tool? It keeps people obedient without needing a whip. The fear of being like Lucifer polices curiosity better than any guard ever could. And the deeper you dig, the more obvious the construction becomes. The figure we call Lucifer is a Frankenstein myth. A mix of Isaiah's Babylonian satire, Greek astronomy, Latin translation, and medieval moralism, all glued together with fear. But the structure holds because the symbol works. It simplifies everything: light equals good, too much light equals evil. Knowledge becomes dangerous. Ambition becomes pride. Curiosity becomes sin. You want to know why this myth stuck? Because it hits the human ego. It warns that the moment you start thinking you're capable of godlike understanding, you're doomed to fall. That's the most efficient way to control minds, by criminalizing transcendence. You don't need bars when people police themselves. And the name does all the heavy lifting. Lucifer. It sounds elegant, seductive, forbidden. It drips with mystique. Say it out loud and you can almost feel the centuries of fear attached to it. That's power. A single mistranslated word holding an entire civilization subconscious hostage. Meanwhile, the actual astronomical Lucifer, Venus, keeps rising and falling like it always did. Bright, unashamed, untamed. The ancients saw that rhythm and understood it as cosmic poetry. The church saw it and turned it into a cautionary tale. Same light, different lens. One inspires awe. The other manufactures obedience. Let's talk about where this whole Lucifer story actually came from, because it didn't drop out of the clouds, it came out of ancient propaganda. Every myth has fingerprints, and this one reeks of empire, politics, and poetic vengeance. The so-called fallen Lightbringer didn't begin as a supernatural being. He began as a metaphor in a trash talk poem aimed at a human ruler, a king who thought he was untouchable. The prophet wasn't describing a war in heaven, he was dragging a tyrant in public. Ancient Babylon was the setting. The empire that enslaved the Israelites, built ziggurats that scraped the clouds, and crowned kings who believed they were walking gods. The prophet Isaiah took that arrogance and turned it into theater. He wrote a poem mocking the Babylonian ruler, calling him the Shining One, son of the dawn. It was pure sarcasm. Oh, look at you, morning star, climbing so high, watch how fast you crash. That's not theology, that's ancient satire. But centuries later, when readers forgot the context, they took the metaphor literally. They turned a roast into a revelation. You have to understand the world Isaiah was living in. Babylon was obsessed with cosmic hierarchy. Kings ruled by divine right, temples mirrored the stars, and human authority was a reflection of celestial order. The idea of a ruler ascending to the heavens wasn't metaphor, it was policy. When a prophet said, "You will fall from the heavens," it wasn't about wings or halos, it was political death. The mighty being dragged back to dust. That's what Lucifer was originally about, the fall of empire, not an angel. Fast forward to the city of Tyre, Ezekiel throws the same shade at its arrogant ruler. He calls him a cherub in Eden, clothed in jewels, walking among fiery stones. Another poetic takedown. Another "you think you're divine, but you're just human" moment. But once again, later readers ripped it from context and fused it with the growing myth of celestial rebellion. The Babylonian and Tyrian kings merged into one archetype, the fallen ruler who wanted to be divine. And when Christianity arrived, that archetype was ready for export. They just swapped king for angel. The real magic trick was how the metaphor evolved. Ancient scribes didn't separate politics from cosmology. When they said "as above, so below," they meant it. The fall of a king symbolized the fall of a star, and vice versa. So when they saw rulers comparing themselves to the morning star, the prophets flipped it on them. You think you're Venus? Then you'll share its fate, bright for a moment, then gone. That's how cosmic imagery worked back then. They weren't predicting the future, they were staging moral theater in the sky. What's fascinating is that this kind of language wasn't unique to Israel. The Canaanites had similar myths about gods who challenged the highest deity and were cast down. The Ugaritic texts mention Helel, a divine figure who tries to ascend above the clouds but fails. The pattern's ancient, a proud being rises, falls, and becomes a warning. It's the celestial version of every fallen empire. The later editors just fused all those stories together until one composite villain emerged. Now, let's be clear, the original audience never imagined this Shining One as Satan. The devil wasn't even a fully formed character yet. The Hebrew Bible barely mentions a personal adversary. Evil was a system, not a person. It took centuries of reinterpretation, translation, and creative fearmongering to turn that poetic fall into the biography of a cosmic rebel. Every generation inflated the story until it became something unrecognizable. By the time medieval theologians got their hands on it, they had transformed a taunt against Babylon into the origin of evil itself. That's how myth grows, layer by layer, mistranslation by mistranslation. The prophet spoke in coded imagery because that's how you survived in an empire. You didn't say, "The king is doomed." You said, "The morning star will fall." Everyone in the room knew what you meant. It was political subversion hidden in poetry. But later readers took that veil literally and turned it into doctrine. Here's where it gets entertaining. The line "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God" was a direct quote from those kings' propaganda. They literally carved that kind of language into temple walls. They believed their rule reflected the stars. Isaiah was mocking them, word for word. But strip away the satire, and it sounds like a divine rebellion. That's the problem, poetry misread as history becomes dogma. And the church loved dogma that served hierarchy. The moment they rebranded the fallen king as a fallen angel, the story became a cosmic warning: don't challenge authority, celestial or earthly. It was perfect symmetry. Babylon's arrogance became a timeless moral lesson, never reach too high. The priests turned political critique into metaphysical fear. That's why the myth stuck. It justified obedience. It told every generation, see what happens when you think you can rise above your station. The irony is that the Bible itself shows the prophet laughing while he says it. How you have fallen, morning star. He's not trembling, he's gloating. It's mockery, not mourning. But centuries later, artists painted it like tragedy. They gave the morning star wings, made him beautiful, then tore him apart midair. They turned satire into cosmic opera. The fall of Babylon became the apocalypse of heaven. You can see the fingerprints of Babylonian cosmology all over it. The ziggurat, the stairway to heaven, was literally a human attempt to reach the divine realm. The prophets condemned it as arrogance. The myth of the Tower of Babel says the same thing, rise too high, get knocked down. The story of Lucifer is that pattern on repeat, hubris punished by descent. It's empire theology recycled into angelology. Let's talk geography for a second. The kings Isaiah mocked ruled from the same land that worshipped Ishtar, the goddess of Venus, the morning star. Every sunrise was her symbol, every fall from the sky her myth. When the prophet used that imagery, everyone knew the reference. He was mocking the divine ego of rulers by comparing them to a goddess whose light fades daily. That's what made it sting. The brilliance that disappears. The pride that burns out. None of this was meant to be taken literally. It was theater, celestial allegory. But translation kills nuance. When Jerome wrote Lucifer into the Vulgate, he froze the metaphor in Latin stone. From then on, it read like a biography, not poetry. That's how the spiritual bureaucracy was born. You had to believe the text literally or risk heresy. The original context, political, poetic, human, was erased. The fallen king became the fallen angel. The metaphor became mythology. And once you have mythology, you can build an empire on it. You can trace how every layer of this story mirrors historical power dynamics. First, prophets use celestial imagery to mock kings. Then later writers use kings as metaphors for divine rebellion. Then the church uses rebellion as justification for obedience. It's the same formula, just repackaged for each era. The story evolves, but the message stays the same, don't rise too high. If you dig deeper, you'll see echoes of older Mesopotamian cycles, deities like Enlil and Inanna, who descend and ascend through the heavens. Those myths were about the balance between cosmic order and chaos. The Hebrews inherited that language and turned it into prophecy. Later, Christian writers stripped away the context and left only the fall. The cycle broke, only punishment remained. The morning star stopped rising. Even the imagery of walking among fiery stones or being cast down to the earth came from ancient temple rituals. The stones referred to sacred gems embedded in the high priest's breastplate, symbolizing divine authority. To fall from among them meant to lose your place in the divine council. Ezekiel's description of the cherub wasn't about wings, it was about status. But once the text was filtered through centuries of translation, that courtroom imagery turned into celestial warfare. It's almost poetic how every empire used the same myth template. A ruler claims divinity, gets punished by heaven, becomes a cautionary tale. Egypt had pharaohs who called themselves sons of the sun. Babylon had kings who built towers to heaven. Rome had emperors who declared themselves gods. And each one eventually fell. The fall of Lucifer is the universal empire obituary rewritten in religious language. It's not just about one being, it's about the eternal pattern of power devouring itself. You want to understand what it really meant when they said Lucifer fell? Forget the Sunday school nonsense about wings catching fire and angels crying in slow motion. This wasn't a fall, it was a reclassification. The moment Lucifer rebelled, he didn't stop being powerful. He didn't even stop being beautiful. He simply got reassigned from divine order to divine opposition. Heaven didn't destroy him, it contained him. And that's the detail the preachers never want to talk about. Lucifer didn't lose his light, he lost his alignment. That's a massive difference. The so-called fault wasn't about being stripped of power, it was about power going off the grid. Imagine the perfect engine suddenly running without a regulator. That's Lucifer. The same brilliance, the same intelligence, now cut loose from the structure that once defined it. That's why he didn't vanish, he became necessary. You can't define order without a counterweight. You can't define obedience without the memory of rebellion. Lucifer became the shadow that made heaven's light visible. Every religious text that describes him post-fall is drenched in contradiction. He's described as the prince of this world, the tempter, the deceiver, but he's also still called the morning star in some versions. The line between damnation and divinity blurred right there. That's not theology, it's damage control. Heaven needed an enemy, and Lucifer was too perfect not to use. The writers try to frame his transformation as moral corruption, but look closely, every description of him after the fall sounds like admiration in disguise. Full of wisdom. Perfect in beauty. Those aren't the words you use for a grotesque monster. Those are the words you use when you're describing something you fear because it mirrors what you once were. The divine order couldn't erase him, so it demonized him. It's the oldest political trick in the book, rebrand your rival as evil. After his exile, Lucifer became the symbol of opposition itself. That's not just spiritual, it's structural. Think of it like a cosmic equation, heaven equals control, Lucifer equals disruption. But here's the catch, both sides need each other. You can't have hierarchy without the threat of disobedience. You can't have worship without something to resist. So when the myth says he rules the kingdoms of the earth, it's not talking about a throne made of bones. It's talking about influence. The concept of autonomy, of thinking for yourself, that was the residue of his rebellion. And yet, the narrative had to make him pay. The punishment wasn't annihilation, it was humiliation. He was turned into the scapegoat for every human failure, every temptation, every flaw. Every time someone questioned divine authority, they blamed him. Convenient, right? The perfect fall guy for a system that can't handle imperfection. Lucifer became theology's catch-all villain. You sin? His fault. You doubt? His whisper. You rebel? His possession. That's not spirituality, that's psychological outsourcing. But the texts also hint at something deeper, something uncomfortable. They describe him as a ruler, still in command, still issuing orders, still orchestrating. The fallen angels didn't scatter in chaos, they formed a hierarchy of their own. That's the part most people ignore, heaven wasn't the only place with structure. The fall didn't destroy order, it duplicated it. Two systems now existed, one ruled by submission, one ruled by defiance. Same architecture, different allegiance. That's why medieval theology obsessed over ranks of demons, legions, thrones, dominions. It's a mirror image of heaven. A counterfeit reflection. The very thing heaven feared became its shadow twin. The kingdom of darkness isn't chaos, it's parallel order. Lucifer didn't burn, he built. You don't recruit a third of heaven and then suddenly forget how to organize. He weaponized hierarchy against itself. When you read descriptions of him as prince of the power of the air, it's not poetry. It's describing a being still operating within creation, still moving through frequencies, still manipulating the structures of influence. If the divine hierarchy governs light, Lucifer governs interpretation. He doesn't create, he distorts. He doesn't destroy, he reconfigures. That's why his punishment is eternal, because his function still exists. He's not in chains, he's in circulation. And this is where the myth turns brutal. The same attributes that made him glorious became the instruments of his downfall. Intelligence became deceit. Beauty became vanity. Willpower became pride. The raw ingredients didn't change, the recipe did. That's what happens when purity gets severed from purpose. You don't lose light, you weaponize it. That's why he's still described as appearing as an angel of light. Because deception doesn't come dressed as horror, it comes disguised as the familiar. The story's warning isn't beware of evil. It's beware of brilliance unbound. The fall also changed the rules of the game. Before Lucifer's rebellion, everything in creation operated on command and obedience. Afterward, Will entered the system. The possibility of choosing against the divine became part of existence. That's the most catastrophic upgrade in cosmic history. Lucifer didn't just disobey, he introduced the idea that disobedience was possible. And once that seed existed, it couldn't be uprooted. Every later myth about temptation, corruption, or knowledge traces back to that one fracture. The serpent in Eden? The same archetype. The voice that says, "You will not surely die?" That's the echo of the same argument Lucifer made in heaven, "You are capable of more." The pattern never changed, it just changed actors. Lucifer's fall was the prototype for every act of defiance that followed. But let's drop the moral framing and talk power dynamics. In every myth system, once the rebel is exiled, he becomes the gatekeeper of what's forbidden. He's not gone, he's stationed at the border between worlds. The fall made Lucifer the ultimate middleman between light and shadow. He knows both systems. He speaks both languages. That's what makes him terrifying, not his hatred, but his fluency. He understands how to manipulate the interface between order and chaos. That's what keeps him relevant, even in the myths that try to erase him. You can see the theological panic in how the narrative evolved. First, he's an angel who falls. Then he becomes the tempter of mankind. Then the god of this world. Each version tries to shrink him, define him, put him in a box, but the myth refuses to stay contained. Because conceptually, Lucifer isn't a character, he's a principle. Every time authority needs a villain, the principle reawakens. That's why the devil in theology looks suspiciously like whatever the culture fears most. And even the supposed defeat in the end, chained, cast into fire, it's metaphorical theater. You can't burn what's made of light. Fire is purification, not destruction. The lake of fire is symbolic containment, a cosmic quarantine. Lucifer doesn't die, he's isolated from resonance. That's why his punishment never ends, because his existence is built into the fabric of duality. Theologians love to paint his fall as justice, but look closely, it's administrative necessity. Heaven couldn't annihilate a being made of divine light. It could only dislocate him. You can't delete light without destabilizing the source that created it. So the system did the only thing it could: exile the anomaly. Lucifer isn't proof of evil's victory, he's proof of creation's limits. Even the iconography betrays the story's double standard. Statues and paintings show him muscular, radiant, defiant, more heroic than demonic. His expression isn't monstrous, it's mournful. He looks like a god exiled for asking the wrong question. Artists knew what the theologians wouldn't say: you can't paint rebellion as ugly without betraying its origin. The most beautiful being in creation fell because beauty itself became unbearable. That's why his legend never died. Because it's not just about damnation, it's about displacement. A being too powerful to erase, too dangerous to restore. The myth doesn't end with his defeat, it loops. The light falls, the light rises, the cycle repeats. Each era repackages him under a new name: Satan, the adversary, the dragon, the prince of lies, but the pattern is the same. Power defies power, order creates opposition, and the story feeds itself. So when people picture Lucifer punished, they're missing the point. The punishment is the role. Eternal opposition. Permanent counterbalance. The fallen one isn't rotting in hell, he's orbiting it. The gravity of his rebellion keeps the system in motion. That's the irony hidden in the myth: Lucifer's greatest defeat was also his eternal relevance. Lucifer's story didn't end in scripture, it evolved. Over the centuries, every civilization, every empire, every ideology took that single fallen figure and remodeled him into something that fit their own agenda. What started as a theological warning turned into an entire cultural industry. From ancient art to modern media, Lucifer has been dissected, rewritten, demonized, and romanticized more than any other character in religious history. And the most shocking part? Every version says more about the people telling it than about Lucifer himself. When Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it inherited not just the name but the mythology of fallen gods. Pagan deities who used to represent knowledge, light, or rebellion were absorbed and repurposed as devils. The church had to neutralize them. Jupiter, Baal, Pan, Prometheus, all of them got pushed down into the same pit. Lucifer became their corporate logo. The devil wasn't one being anymore. He was a merger of every outlawed god, every forbidden truth, every cultural threat to Christian authority. The old pantheon didn't vanish, it got rebranded. In medieval Europe, the image of Lucifer became propaganda. Art and theology worked hand in hand to scare the masses. Paintings in cathedrals showed him falling, burning, writhing. Not because anyone had seen it, but because fear kept people obedient. The priests controlled the narrative. Heaven was order, hell was chaos, and Lucifer was the face of chaos itself. It was a brilliant social technology. Keep people terrified of questioning authority by turning cosmic rebellion into the ultimate crime. Writers took the myth and weaponized it. Dante's Inferno cemented the image of Lucifer as a frozen, winged monster at the bottom of hell. Not fiery, frozen. That detail mattered. He wasn't the ruler of hell, he was its prisoner. The idea that the most brilliant being in existence ended up immobilized, chewing on traitors, was the church's psychological victory. It said, no matter how high you rise, rebellion leads nowhere. That imagery became gospel long before the Bible itself was widely read. Then came the Renaissance, and the tone started to shift. Artists like Michelangelo and poets like Milton cracked the code. They turned Lucifer back into what he always represented, defiance with style. Milton's Paradise Lost made him eloquent, magnetic, and dangerously relatable. He became the prototype of the tragic hero, intelligent, wronged, self-aware. The line "better to reign in hell than serve in heaven" hit like a bomb across Europe. People began to see him not as a monster, but as a symbol of free will. And that terrified the church. You can track that anxiety in censorship laws and inquisitions. Anything that even hinted at sympathy for the devil was heresy. Yet the idea refused to die. Enlightenment thinkers started using Lucifer as a symbol of intellectual rebellion. Voltaire, Blake, Shelley, they all saw him as the personification of human reason rising against tyranny. Blake's famous phrase, "The reason Milton wrote in chains when of angels he wrote, he was of the devil's party without knowing it," wasn't just poetry. It was an accusation. The very act of creation, of questioning divine order, was Luciferian. By the 18th and 19th centuries, secret societies and occult movements started reclaiming the name openly. Lucifer became a title of honor among those who rejected blind faith. He symbolized enlightenment, illumination, the courage to challenge authority. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, later even Aleister Crowley's Thelema, all used the archetype of the light-bringer as a metaphor for knowledge forbidden by dogma. The irony is almost comical. The church spent centuries demonizing him for bringing light, and the occult embraced him for exactly the same reason. Then the 20th century turned Lucifer into pop culture. Movies, books, and television stripped away the theology and gave him a human face. Not a beast, not a serpent, but a fallen intellectual, a misunderstood rebel. From Milton's poetic anti-hero to the suave devil of Paradise Lost, to modern shows that portray him as charming, witty, and relatable, Lucifer became the world's most marketable villain. People no longer feared him, they identified with him. The character evolved from divine antagonist to the symbol of individualism in a world obsessed with control. And that shift says everything about modern culture. The more institutions fail to live up to their ideals, the more society gravitates toward the rebel archetype. Lucifer stopped being the enemy of God and became the patron saint of self-definition. The myth inverted itself. The very thing that once warned humanity against pride now fuels art, music, politics, and philosophy. Every modern anti-hero, V for Vendetta, Tony Stark, even Batman, carries a piece of the Lucifer archetype. Defiant, intelligent, morally grey, unstoppable. The line between villain and visionary blurred, and Lucifer became the prototype for both. But beneath all the artistic reinventions, there's a continuity that never dies. The ancient idea that light can fall, and fallen light can still illuminate. It's the paradox that keeps the myth alive. Theologians tried to bury it under fear, artists resurrected it with fascination. Philosophers used it as metaphor, entertainers sold it as spectacle. And each layer added new meaning. Lucifer became the mirror of human ambition, our brilliance and our blindness fused into one symbol. Even modern theology had to adapt. As biblical scholarship advanced, experts started admitting what we've already covered: the word Lucifer wasn't even a proper name in the original text. It was a metaphor. But by then, the image had gone global. The church couldn't erase it, so it leaned into it. Modern preachers still use the story to warn about pride, ego, and sin, but it's marketing now, not revelation. The devil became a brand, and fear became a product. Hollywood ran with it. Lucifer became the star of horror franchises, TV dramas, graphic novels, even romantic comedies. He sells records, headlines fashion lines, and fills tattoos. The symbol that once terrified the faithful is now mainstream rebellion. And that's not coincidence, it's evolution. Every era projects its own values onto him. In the Middle Ages, he was punishment. In the Enlightenment, protest. In the 21st century, personality. The myth survives because it adapts. And the irony couldn't be sharper. The same culture that once built cathedrals to keep his image out now makes billions putting him on screens. The fallen angel became entertainment, art, identity. But strip away the modern gloss, and you're still looking at the same ancient figure, a being that embodies the tension between order and freedom. That's why the story never fades. Because it's not about religion anymore, it's about humanity. Every time someone challenges the system, every time authority is questioned, the shadow of that fallen light flickers in the background. In academic circles, Lucifer has even become a psychological archetype. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the repressed part of human nature that must be confronted rather than denied. The fall becomes internal, not cosmic. Lucifer stops being an external demon and turns into the symbol of the mind's confrontation with its own limits. That's why modern storytelling keeps circling back to him. He's not a monster in the dark, he's the light that exposes the dark. The myth has moved from heaven to the human psyche. If you look closely, every culture that has touched the Lucifer myth ends up revealing its own relationship with power. The church used him to enforce obedience. The philosophers used him to symbolize freedom. The artists used him to explore beauty and loss. And the modern world uses him to sell the idea of rebellion as lifestyle. The myth has outgrown religion. It's an ecosystem of meaning, part theology, part psychology, part entertainment, all contradiction. The evolution of Lucifer isn't just a story of translation and theology, it's a timeline of how human civilization defines itself. We've gone from fearing rebellion to worshipping it. From condemning intellect to celebrating it. From casting down the Lightbringer to dressing him in designer suits and giving him his own Netflix series. That's not blasphemy, that's branding. Humanity turned its oldest villain into a mirror of its own evolution. Thank you for watching this far, for staying through the chaos, the history, and the uncomfortable truths. This story has traveled thousands of years through politics, religion, art, and language, and you made it to the end of that journey. I appreciate your time, your focus, and your curiosity. Until next time, thank you for watching.